guys, and welcome back to the Mindful Method podcast. Today I have a very special episode, my first interview, and it's with Steve Schwartz. And he is a longtime Lsat tutor and the speaker on the Lsat Unplugged podcast and one of the Lsat pros on the Lsat Pros podcast. So Steve, want to introduce yourself? Tell us how long you've been working on Lsat prep.
Yeah, sure, Nina. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here. I've been teaching the Lsat now for over 10 years. My journey with the Lsat started back when I was considering law school myself. I took the Lsat, I took a practice test actually, and I bombed it. I got a 152, and I'd gone to an Ivy League school. I thought I was going to go to a top 14 law school, so that was a pretty rude awakening. And over the course of what ended up being an entire year, I gradually, painstakingly brought my scores up from the low 150s up to a 175 on test day.
Nice.
Yeah, it was incredibly gratifying and a big achievement. And once I did that, folks started asking me for help. So I started helping friends. I started teaching it as well because I had taught other standardized tests before. So it seemed a natural progression. And then I ended up getting so obsessed with the Lsat. It's such a complex exam. And so I just kept teaching it. And then when it came time to submit law school applications, I decided, you know what? Maybe I don't want to do this, at least not for now. I kept teaching. I then started the Lsat blog website and more recently the Lsat Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. And so now over 10 years later, this is my full-time profession.
Right. And I see a lot of students that are just all over the internet referencing your videos because if I recall, you've gone through a lot of the tests and you break down your video by test and by section for, let's say, the logic games. You'll do sets from each logic games, and they seem to be organized in such a way where you cover a lot of the past exams. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your YouTube channel?
Yeah, sure. So it's the Lsat Unplugged YouTube channel. You can find it at youtube.com/lsatblog. And I release new videos there every single day, even on the weekends. I do discussions like this. I do online classes. I do recordings of my in-person classes in New York City. And then I also just do shorter videos that are bite-sized, maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, covering various aspects of Lsat prep, whether it's logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension, test day prep, law school admissions. And then I also do detailed walkthrough explanations for a variety of Lsat logic games. And I'll start doing the same soon with logical reasoning and reading comprehension as well. So I try to just kind of cover everything that somebody could possibly have a question about related to the Lsat. And then the Lsat Unplugged podcast is kind of a variation of the YouTube channel. So a lot of the audio from the YouTube videos will also become podcast episodes.
So that's great so that people can listen on the go. I know I've seen a lot of people asking about how they can bring their studying on the go, like whether they're mothers and they don't have time to themselves or they're full-time students and working. So it's nice that you have that option for them so that you can get some practice in while you're driving or while you're just sitting, eating your lunch or something like that. So I think in this day and age, it's really nice to have options like that. And as you know, and as we've discussed, I like to promote work-life balance, especially emphasized during test prep. So if you can find ways to fit in studying that make it easier to manage your time and your stress will be, managed better too, because you'll be getting something productive done, then I really appreciate, programs like what you offer and your podcasts and YouTube. So
thanks. I appreciate that. And it's great because let's say you're on the subway. If you have Wi-Fi, you could stream a YouTube video. Or if you're somewhere else, let's say you're in the kitchen and you want to cook, you could listen to the online class of a recording of a class on your phone while you're cooking. So you don't have to choose either or. You can actually have both. So I think that one of the great things about podcasts and YouTube is that it kind of lets you gain this passive time to absorb information and still do other things at the same time. You don't have to be parked in front of the computer or parked in a physical class somewhere.
Right. So, I know we're talking a little bit about how people can be studying and, especially people that are already further on in their studies. But one question that I get asked a lot and that I see people asking a lot is, where do I start? So do you want to walk people through maybe some kind of timeline or what resources you like for people to start with? Let's say you're a very beginner to the Lsat.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So the first thing I would suggest is actually not to take a diagnostic practice test. A lot of people will suggest that, and there are certainly arguments in favor of it, but the results of an initial diagnostic can typically be pretty discouraging. And it's natural that you wouldn't score where you ultimately want to because you haven't exposed yourself to the Lsat yet. It's like a foreign language. And so most people don't do well at first glance. Like I mentioned, I certainly didn't. I got a 152, and that was not indicative of my full potential. But at the time, it seemed like a disaster, especially the logic games, which were so unfamiliar to me. And so I'd say, don't take a diagnostic, or at least if you do, take it with like 10,000 grains of salt.
Right.
What you want to do instead is just say, I don't know this exam yet, and that's okay. I can break it down step by step, day by day, and figure out exactly what I should be doing and what not to do. And that's actually one of the first things I did when I created the Lsat blog, was to create study schedules week by week and day by day to break it down for students. So let's say you want to start with logic games because that's the most unfamiliar, scary section at first. You start with the logic games, you do them by type, ordering, grouping, combination, and so on. But even within ordering, you do easy ordering, then moderate ordering, then difficult ordering, then easy grouping, moderate grouping, difficult grouping, and so on. So by type and by difficulty, so you're not exposing yourself to anything too challenging or too daunting at first. You kind of meet yourself where you're at in that moment. So in my schedule, I'll say, read this page in this prep book, read these articles on my site, watch these videos, then complete these specific practice problems from the official Lsat exams. And then I'll do the same for logical reasoning, the same for reading comp. In terms of timelines, I'd say most folks want to devote 2 to 3 months. That's really not enough time, in my opinion. I typically find students reach their fullest potential in at least 5 to 6 months, if not longer. And I'm not saying it should take you a full year like it did for me, but the Lsat is worth the time investment of at least 5 to 6 months, given how important it is in the admissions process.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point. I do see a lot of people trying to study or cram or figure out some kind of quick fix. And, for me personally, I studied for 6 months, and I think like 3 of them were pretty intense. But I also feel like if you're going to invest all of this time already as it is to do something you need to do in order to do something you want to do, which is go to law school, you should take your time with it and get the best possible outcome you can, because you are being short-sighted if you just want to rush through it and get into law school for the next session. Like, you really should take your time with it, because I know we've talked in the last episode we just had all about financial incentives, whether you're going to get, if you get a great Lsat score, the best one you can get, you could either get really great admissions into great schools and work from those opportunities depending what your goals are, or you can get scholarships that really help you out in the long run. 10 years later, you'll still be grateful for that scholarship. So I think the common denominator there is really taking your time and really reaching your highest potential. So I thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
No, of course. And it's crazy, but the value of even a single point on the Lsat, I saw one study calculating it to be around $4,000 in 2019 money. But if you look at how $4,000 would appreciate over the course of your entire career, think 30 years down the line, how much that would grow. And so if it gets you into a better law school, or it gets you more scholarship money, that savings or that career potential boost is enormous in terms of the doors that it could open for you, or as you've experienced on your end, Nina, like being able to graduate without taking on debt for tuition, right? Mm-hmm. Like being able to go to law school with a full ride, that lets you do what you want to do when you graduate versus having to take the job higher, even if it's not really where your passions lie.
Exactly. And to me, that's one of the most important things that really kind of, I always had this idea of work-life balance and doing something that I loved, but it wasn't until I was afforded that opportunity, literally afforded that opportunity with money or the lack of having to owe money, that I was able to go do whatever I wanted to do. And, it's not something that is that far off for other people. There's a lot of people that get scholarship offers, even if it's not full. You can take, the job that you want at legal aid if you really want to help people. And maybe you might not be able to do that if you do go to NYU and you don't get a scholarship, because legal aid pays the same whether you went to NYU or whether you went to St. John's or something. So I think it's really important. And you brought up a good point about, the money appreciating. So in my position, once you're in law school, I think it was, I'm not sure if it's an ABA recommendation, but definitely my school had us sign something saying that we wouldn't get a job in our first, I think like more than 12 hours a week or something like that within our first year of law school. Like we were prohibited from working for whatever reason. And many people were complaining because they were suffering financially and they were owing all this money. Even if, they were deferring it, it was still looming over their head. But I looked at it as, okay, let's say my tuition was at that time $47,000 a year. It was as if I was making $70,000 after taxes. It was as if I had like a job with a starting salary of $70,000 every year, because the money was just going straight to my tuition, and it really worked out. And, there's still going to be financial issues that arise, but it's, you're right. Like every point on the LSAT does have a monetary value, and that's not a way that most people think of it. So I guess after you would say, all right, here you go through each one of the sections and you start to acquaint yourself with each section: logical games, reasoning, and reading comp. When do you usually suggest people take their first practice test?
That's a great question. I would say probably after no longer than a month or two, just because you do want to start getting into the experience of taking full-length timed exams. I'd say there's 3 phases of LSAT prep. There's accuracy, which is learning the basics untimed, building your foundation. Then there's pacing, which is doing individual timed sections and getting used to that 35-minute time constraint. Then there's the endurance, doing full-length 5-section timed exams, which is a lot. And you'll see the books of LSAT exams, they only contain 4 sections because they're not going to publish the experimental section. That'll be used for a future LSAT test form. And so what you got to use, you got to take a section from another exam and kind of splice it in to the one that you are doing, so that you can get the full experience of the 5 sections with only a 10 or 15-minute break in the middle. And it's a lot. So you definitely want to start doing that on the earlier side. And I'd say you want to do at least 10 sittings like that before you actually take your official LSAT exam.
Right. So in terms of, experimental sections, that's a really good point. It's not something I've talked about on my channel before. Maybe I might have mentioned it briefly, but can you explain to my listeners what the experimental section is and what it would be used for?
Yeah, sure. So the experimental section is basically a way for LSAC, the test makers, to test out future LSAT questions that will be scored questions on a future LSAT exam. So they're not counted against your LSAT score, but you do have to do them, and they don't tell you which one it is. There's not a big sign saying experimental on it. They want you to give it your full effort and take it seriously, which is not maybe the nicest thing to do, but just you're paying it forward just as someone else did your sections for you.
Yeah.
So it could be any one of the 5, and it could be any of logic games, logical reasoning, or reading comprehension. So there's total randomness. You never know. You could have an experimental game section. Someone else has experimental reading comp. And the only way to tell which one was experimental would be afterwards, talking with other test takers. People typically go on forums and talk about it online after the exam. And so you could see even that if you had 2 game sections or 2 reading comps or 3 logical reasonings, you would know that any one of those would have been your experimental, because the scored exam will only have 1 games, 1 reading comp, and 2 logical reasonings.
Right. I think on my tests, I had 2 logic games sections, which I was so happy about because that was my favorite section. I find that people either love logic games or they hate logic games. So what's your take on logic games, and what's your number 1 tip for people to improve logic games? Because I found that it is the easiest to improve, and you can get 100% consistently, unlike with logical reasoning or reading comp. So what's your number 1 tip for people that, might be struggling with logic games now and hate them?
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say do a lot of games. That's the only way to get better at them is through increased familiarity. And I love them now. They're my favorite section now. Maybe they're kind of tied with logical reasoning, maybe, but I'd say that they're my favorite. They're one of my favorites now. I love them now because they're so mathematical, and I'm not a math person, but the kind of way of thinking they test is actually pretty streamlined. There's not that many varieties that they can have on the exam. And so if you've done a handful of the older games, then you'll be well prepared for whatever you might encounter on LSAT test day. So at first, of course, you're going to bomb them. That's normal. That's natural, especially if you're from more of a humanities background. But you do them by type and grouped by style or format. For example, there are a lot of games that have repeated over time with only slight variations. I have a whole list of them I could rattle off, but I'll give one example. There's this game from Prep Test 33, Game 2, which is The Birds in the Forest. It's a classic logic game that's often used for instructional purposes because it tests these basic concepts in a very straightforward way. And there have been like 6 other games on the Lsat over the years in subsequent exams that are just like it. And so if you master that old one, you'll be ready for the new ones that come later.
Right. And that's so true because, the more that you do them, the more you see similarities. And maybe it might be birds in a forest in one game, but the next test, like 3 years later or something, don't quote me on that, it might be colors of hats on different people. But I found that when I was studying for the LSAT, my logic game books was also the smallest. It was the thinnest of all of the big, large books. So I brought it around with me everywhere. And I can personally say that that is what helped me get the score I got on logic games, was just doing a lot of them and getting to a point where you can score 100% consistently because you can predict and you can have fun with them. It's not like reading comprehension, which might be boring depending on what the subject is. So I'm a logic games lover. But,
yeah, same. And I should mention, there's also a lot of value in redoing the same exact game again and again and again. That's something I should really emphasize, I think. Like when I first started teaching this exam, the newest book of exams was the set in the 30s, 29 to 38. And I taught those same games like literally hundreds of times. And doing a particular game for the 100th time or the 200th time, I might see a slight nuance that I hadn't seen in any of the previous attempts, or maybe a more efficient way to do it. And so I'm not saying you should do it 100 times, but even doing the same game 5 or 10 times, you'll start to see new angles on it or techniques you could use to solve it that you previously hadn't.
Right. And that's a good point, because especially with time, you might see ways that you can, if you're going to draw it out, you could draw it out quicker, or you can save yourself a step and you can I found, and it's a little bit hard to explain, but another tip that I used to increase my logic games performance was playing Sudoku on my phone. There's no real parallel between Sudoku and logic games, but there's something about that way of thinking and getting your brain in that mode where you can, even if you don't draw out every single step you do, like you can calculate the steps in your head and just it makes sense because that's where it has to go and you see it. And so there's that kind of, I can't articulate what that is in your brain or what kind of skill that is, but there is a parallel between games like that, Sudoku, and the logic games and the LSAT. And it's something that, the more you do it, the quicker you are and the more you see connections that maybe you can't articulate, but not everyone's trying to be an LSAT tutor. They're trying to just take the test and get, it's bad for us that I can't articulate it, but it's good for you if like you see the connection and, you're just able to make those leaps really quickly. So yeah, logic games is a very difficult section at first, but one that's easy to improve. So what would be your tips, switching gears to maybe logical reasoning? What is your tips for something like logical reasoning that takes a lot more time and attention to improve than something like logic games?
Yeah, sure. Well, logical reasoning, of course, is worth a lot of time. It's half the exam. It's half the scored sections. So it's also somewhat unfamiliar at first. It's obviously text. You're reading short, bite-sized arguments, but there's a lot jam-packed into just a short paragraph. And so it's worth slowing down and taking the time to dissect the stimulus thoroughly. What's the conclusion? What's the evidence? What's the gap in between them? A lot of time, folks will focus on doing questions by question stem type, like is it strengthen or weaken or must be true, and that's useful. But I also recommend looking at the viewpoint of the stimulus itself. Is it a fact set or an argument? If it's an argument, what's the gap like? Is it a small gap or is it a big gap? How is LSAC framing it with the question stem to guide you in how to view the argument in terms of the method of reasoning and how reasonable it is? So it's really important kind of to take the stimulus as if somebody were speaking to you and you were having a conversation with them and you're pointing out why they're dumb or trying to help them boost up their argument.
Right.
Now, I think when it comes to the answer choices, folks should spend a lot more time engaging in excruciatingly detailed review of the choices and their thought process when they engaged with them. So let's say you got it wrong. What was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it? And what ultimately makes it wrong? And what's discouraging about the right answer choice that pushes you away from it? And what ultimately makes it correct? So there's these traps of encouragement towards the wrong answer and traps of discouragement pushing you away from the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to force yourself to engage in that process. And it's not easy. Most folks don't do it enough. And I'm not saying you should do it for every single question that ever gave you trouble, but for at least the hardest ones, it's worth articulating this, writing it down, or at least, speaking about it with someone else.
Right. And that's something I think is a really important skill to learn, especially for people that do go on to law school and you end up graduating and you take the bar. There were so many parallels between the bar exam, MBE questions, or UBE, they're now called, and the Lsat, logical reasoning. So for listeners who might not know, the bar exam has 3 sections. You have an MPT, which is like a DBQ if you ever did a document-based question in school. Those are easy. Then you have essays, and then you have 200 multiple choice questions, which are all about substantive topics you learn in law school, but written exactly like logical reasoning with the same tempting answer choices, the same thought process. You really want to make sure you're reading every question answer, because sometimes you get to answer B and it looks good and you're like, all right, this is B, and you move on. But then C would be more right. And people are frustrated by that idea of, okay, it could be right, but more right. But that's just the nature of being a lawyer. And it's the nature of argument, and the nature of logic is that, yeah, some things are right, but some things are better. Some things are fit better into that sequence. And so that was a very, very insightful way that you broke down the process between facts or arguments, because that is, it does make a big difference in the way that you should read and view the answer choices. And yeah, that's actually really good advice. I hope everybody wrote that down and it goes through the process that way. So now, speaking of reading question stimuli and versus question stems, there's been some debate over different test prep providers on which you should do first. So are you someone who suggests that they read the question stem first or the paragraph first?
That's a great question. I'll preface this by saying that I don't think it really matters that much which one you read first.
Mm-hmm.
Back when I was studying and back when I took the exam and got my 175, I actually read stimulus first.
Mm-hmm.
But over the years, I've actually changed my approach, where now I read the question stem first.
Mm-hmm.
I like question stem first because it gives you a unique perspective and the correct perspective from which to view the stimulus. I've talked earlier about arguments containing a gap. Is it a small gap or is it a big gap? And I said LSAC tells you. They tell you the correct way to view it based on the question stem. If they're saying it's a flaw question or the stimulus is vulnerable to criticism, they're saying we should view the argument's gap as being enormous and not give the arguer the benefit of the doubt. On the other hand, when you have an argument, like a question that's like necessary assumption, they're saying there is an assumption, there is a gap, but we are giving kind of like the principle of generosity. We're extending that towards the arguer and saying they didn't fail to consider this. They just didn't bother to explicitly state this. Now, obviously, there are questions that are stimuli that are fundamentally flawed, but there are some where the gap, there's kind of shades of gray as to whether it's crossing the line into being unreasonable or not. I'm thinking back to, I didn't go to law school, but I know that you did, so maybe you're familiar with, in freedom of speech, we have this idea of like, what would incite someone to violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Speech would incite someone to cross the line and commit a violent act. It's based on this reasonable person standard. But who's to say who the reasonable person is, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's open to interpretation. It's open to debate. And so I think that LSAC's perspective in the question stem tells us how we should look at it.
From the standpoint of a reasonable person. And that is a great point because, you will have to identify later on in law school, there's in legal writing, there's so many forms of legal writing, whether you're writing a case brief, you're writing a memo, you're writing a motion, you're writing a paper or a letter. You always have to identify who's your audience and transform who you are as a speaker and your language and your tone that you use and because legal writing is very technical. You have to transform the way you write based on who the audience is. So if you reverse that on the LSAT and you think, okay, who's the speaker? And that's something I usually talk about when I talk about reading comprehension is, are they someone who's advocating for someone? Are they someone that's stating facts? Are they trying to convince you of something? What are they trying to do? What position are they in? And do you see how that affects the way things sound and the way things are written? And yeah, maybe they're going to miss, inevitably, they're going to miss some certain gaps in the argument, because that's what the LSAT is. You're supposed to identify them and fill in the gaps. But I think that's a really insightful point, because it's something that is talked about once you get into law school, but not so much, from the standpoint of test prep, is this idea of who's the speaker, who's the audience. The audience is a reasonable person, and how that affects the way that the questions unfold. So I guess on that note, what's your biggest what do you think about that in terms of who the speaker is for things like reading comprehension? And I guess even in some ways, some of the longer logical reasoning passages too, where they tell you like, okay, this is a proponent of something. But
yeah, I started thinking about that when you were talking about the speaker and advocating versus or describing facts. I think that we always want to be reading with intention in mind. The reading comprehension is not nearly so much about the details and the facts as is about seeing what the author's opinion is, if any, and the various viewpoints of parties within the passage itself. So if you have like scientists or lawyers or philosophers or a particular scholar, what is their opinion? What's their objective? What's their viewpoint? Why are they saying this? So you're kind of thinking about their methods of reasoning and the roles that different statements play. So it's very technical, it's structural. Then you have parallels in logical reasoning, of course, as well, where they're asking you to see what is the method of reasoning and how they go about making their arguments. You want to read with that in mind for much more than actually the facts themselves.
Absolutely. And, at the end of the day, this test is testing your ability to be a professional in the legal field. And something that lawyers have to do is they have to read something and not take it as Bible just because it's written and just because it's said. You have to read everything through the lens of skepticism. You have to read everything with, the ability to deduce what their motive is, why are they saying this, what's the context, and that's why these questions are so important. A lot of people dismiss standardized tests, even if they're good at them or even if they perform poorly, they dismiss standardized tests as saying, it's not indicative of how you'd perform in a certain career. But I totally disagree when it comes to the LSAT. Not that you have to get the highest score ever to be a good lawyer, but you have to understand what the test is testing for you to understand what your career entails and the kinds of reasoning that you need to use every single day when someone's telling you something, when your client's sitting across from you and they're telling you, oh yeah, like let's say your criminal law, like, oh, like I just borrowed the car, I didn't know it was stolen or something. You have to be able to deduce the truth and make educated guesses. And even when you read newspapers, that's a good way to study for the LSAT. Read the newspaper and understand who's saying what they're saying and why. What's their motive for writing this article? So I think those are all really good points, and something that people, they get wrapped up in the test and they don't realize how much it actually involves a lot of common sense. So with that, my next question for you would be, where do you think common sense comes into play with the LSAT? And I see a lot of people, freaking out about outside information being brought in and this idea of the LSAT being a vacuum in and of itself. So how do you reconcile that with things like the reasonable person standard and things like common sense?
That's a great question. It's hard to articulate a hard and fast rule about this. It's something that you have to kind of just gain familiarity with as you do more and more LSAT questions. You don't have to do every exam ever released, but I think that doing at least a couple dozen would be valuable to start to get a sense of LSAC's rhythm and what they consider to be outside, what they consider to not be outside. So for example, the days of the week, Saturday through Friday, right? Or Monday to Sunday, whatever it is, the days of the week go in a particular order. Numbers go in a particular order. Letters of the alphabet go in a particular order. And then there's also things like climate change and heart disease and car speeding and things like that happen in the real world. And so I think if you do more LSAT questions, you will get a better sense of it. There is no real outside information being brought in that the average person on the street wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. Occasionally, outside information can help you. it makes you feel more comfortable with something, but it can also sometimes hurt you if it leads you to bring in something that wasn't actually stated in the passage and lets you make a particular assumption. So I'll give you an example. One of my favorite LSAT questions is from, I think, test 38. It involves a doctor who is a smoker and wants to ban smoking in public.
Oh, I remember this one.
Oh, yeah, you remember this? I love this one. This one's great.
Go through it.
Yeah, it's great. So this doctor, he's a smoker, wants to ban smoking in public places. Now, we think doctors shouldn't smoke. It's strange that a doctor would smoke. So we're already kind of confused by this. Then the smoker wants to ban smoking in a public place. You would think a smoker wants smoking to be permitted everywhere so they can smoke wherever they want. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that are counterintuitive in this particular example. But outside knowledge would say doctors don't smoke and smokers don't want to ban smoking. And so that can lead you to have a kind of disconnect that can slow you down or confuse you and get you all tripped up, right? And so that's where I think outside information and assumptions can actually really hurt you. And you need to always just stick to simply what's in the text, nothing's more, nothing beyond that. I mean, there are things like obviously the sun comes up in the morning and goes down at night, or the days of the week and things like that. But beyond that, there's not really much to bring in from the outside knowledge previously.
Right. And so for that question, can you just, for the sake of resolving it for our listeners who might not have been exposed, do you recall what the actual premise of the question was? Like, it wasn't touching on those two outside information, pieces of outside information. What was the premise of that question with the doctor?
That's a great question. So it was actually, I believe it was a parallel reasoning flaw question. So parallel flaw, where there was another example in the stimulus. It's escaping me at the moment, but basically this was actually the correct answer to it. So sorry for anyone ruining test 38 for you. It's old enough that it didn't really matter. But the idea is that there was another similarly counterintuitive flaw in the stimulus. And so you had to match it with this example with the doctor.
Got it. Yep. And so that's something that, the LSAT will play a lot with, or the parallel reasoning, and, testing your ability to look at something and have that innate ability to question it, but also to recognize that at the end of the day, this is a test that you need to just look at what's being said to you in the test question and evaluate it based on that. So yes, outside information comes in. It can be helpful in, making inferences and things like that. But at the same time, you need to be able to just evaluate what's given to you and make your most logical reasoning based on that. And, that's something that I think is one of the most overwhelming parts of test taking. It's hard to look at every question in a vacuum when you have things like time racing against you and you're overwhelmed by the tests and all the other questions. So now, which leads me to my next question, is we've connected a little bit about mindfulness techniques, and I don't think we've talked about it in this episode yet, but also just so people on the viewers or listeners and on the Mindful Method podcast know, Steve and I just recorded another episode all for his podcast, the Lsat Unplugged, but where we talked about a lot of mindfulness techniques and how to balance life with work and LSAT prep. So what's your what's like either your routine or what's your favorite things to do, or your takeaways, or what you tell students to do in order to find balance between LSAT prep and just working nonstop?
Yeah, sure. So the study schedules I created, I mentioned earlier, they go into this a bit. Basically, you want to carve out time every single day and every single week. So in my study schedules, I build in days off, typically 2 or 3 per week. And then within a particular day, you want to carve out the time for studying, but also carve out time for other things. So let's say somebody is able to study full time, where they're not working, they're not in school, they're in a very fortunate position, of course, to be able to study full time. Then they run the risk of burnout. And so I'd say maybe you wake up, you shower, you have breakfast, you exercise, then you study from, let's say, 9 to 12, take a break for lunch, then study from, let's say, 1 to 4. That could be it. Limit your studying to no more than 5 to 6 hours max per day, so that you have time for all those things I've mentioned, like sleep, diet, exercise, mindfulness, relaxation, a walk in the park, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. If you're working, it can be hard to fit in the time to study, and folks will often worry and stress out about not getting it done, or they'll save it for late at night between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight. Then they have to wake up at 5 or 6 to go to work again or something like that. And so I'd say try to study. If you're working, try to save studying for right before you start working. So let's say you typically get to work at 9, maybe get to work at 7:30 or 8 instead. And while you're at the office or at a coffee shop nearby, you could carve out a few hours to study. And then after work, same thing, carve out a few hours before you go home. That way you've knocked it out. You're done. You don't have to think about it. Otherwise, it's kind of hanging over you as like the last thing you do that day, and you can't go to sleep till it happens. But if you wait till then, 10 p.m., you're exhausted, you're tired, you had a big day at work or whatever it was, and then you're not going to be at your sharpest. And there's nothing worse than studying and not getting good results because you were tired, not because you understand it. But as we've discussed, the LSAT requires you to be at your fullest potential, your top 100% capacity. If you're even just a little bit off, if you're tired or distracted, your performance will suffer, and it's not even your fault. So
exactly.
Carve out the time earlier to make sure it happens while you're fresh.
Right. And these are things that I also recommend people do, even during law school as well, because if you carve out those times before the rest of the world wakes up, so to speak, and people aren't bothering you, you will have so much room to make progress in that 1 hour of uninterrupted time than you would in 3 hours of interrupted time. And this also comes into play with like everything as a whole. So if you wake up early, then you might say, okay, well then how am I going to eat? So pack like a healthy breakfast, bring it with you, pack a light, healthy dinner so that you can just pick up your books after work and then go to that local coffee shop or bookshop and do the work, you know, and not have to worry about rushing home to make dinner. I know everybody has different responsibilities, but it's all like this whole work-life balance idea is all complementary. It's not mutually exclusive. It's not like you have one without the other. It all fits together quite nicely. And then you will be energized and you will be fueling your body and hydrating yourself and allowing yourself to have the energy to go through this test, because studying is draining. It drains your energy completely. And then taking the test, especially when you get to the point, like you mentioned earlier, of taking 10 practice tests at least throughout your test prep program, that is so draining on your energy. And you want to be able to, like you mentioned, have your peak productivity be the day of the test. So it's really important. So I guess, you know, you guys have heard from the pro here. He's done this for so many years and he's telling you to take it like a marathon, not a sprint. Do you want to leave everybody off with one last piece of advice and then let everybody know how they can reach you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nina. So I guess the takeaway advice I'll leave you with is don't overly stress about the LSAT, especially not any one particular LSAT administration, because the LSAT, of course, as a whole is important for law school admissions. But whatever test date you're registered for will not make or break you. You can always retake the LSAT. Law schools do not average multiple LSAT scores, and they're offering it more frequently than ever before. It used to be only 4 times a year. Now it's going to be 9 or 10 times a year. And so for those of you who are looking ahead to the rest of 2019, there's June and July, there's September, October, November, and it's well worth retaking if you think you can do better. So whatever happens next time, just know you do have future opportunities available to you. Great. Now, as for how folks can reach me, I'm Steve Schwartz again. I run the Lsat blog. You can also check me out on the Lsat Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. The Lsat Unplugged podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and pretty much everywhere else.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming and joining our show and for having me on your show. And I look forward to talking more about these things. I mean, they're really important and they intersect quite nicely. You know, work-life balance and LSAT prep, if there's ever a time you're going to master both, it should be together. So yeah, thank you so much. And I hope that people, consider you when they need some advice.
Sure. I'm here if they need me. Well, thanks for having me, Nina.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.